Part of the MCA's remit deals with digital accessibility and particularly website accessibility in the public sector. This allows the MCA to support social inclusion for people with disabilities, as well as other disadvantaged groups such as the elderly. The aim is to ensure that everybody can contribute to and benefit from the digital economy and society.
Our next speaker is Inka Taagehøj, who, through a live video call, will be talking about best practices as far as web accessibility is concerned. Ms. Taagehøj is an accessibility product expert and trainer. She works in product management at SiteImprove, helping large public organizations and companies to grow their accessibility maturity, become compliant and maintain a high level of digital inclusion that ensures the best possible website experiences for everyone. Welcome, Ms. Taagehøj.
Thank you. And thank you for the great event. I've been following from Copenhagen and really wish I was there, but now I'm here. So let's get to business. My part is to talk about basically a practical introduction to accessibility, what it is and who should have an understanding of it. Yes, that's me, Inka Taagehøj. I'm indeed working as an accessibility product expert in SiteImprove. And really my job is there to ensure that the product management and development are always up to date on customer needs and industry trends around accessibility and content experience as well. And I'm doing a lot of training and education around automated accessibility monitoring, both internally and externally. I'm indeed placed in Copenhagen, and maybe next time you're hosting an event, I will be able to join you there on site as well. So what is digital accessibility? In a nutshell, it means that websites and applications can be perceived, operated, and fully understood without any barriers by everyone. And today, indeed, I want to talk about what it requires from organizations in practical terms. So let's start with a fact. People with disabilities use technology, telephones, smart TVs, websites, mobile apps, software, interactive service screens, and so on every single day. And that is awesome because internet for people with disabilities is a real boost. It makes life easier when you can have online access to services such as banking and food shopping. And you can do that from the comfort of your own sofa. Internet can be the place where you can feel truly equal with others, considering that the websites you need are accessible. People with disabilities use assistive technologies and adaptive strategies to enable themselves. It's core to us as humans that we want to maintain our autonomy and independence wherever it's possible. Nobody should need to rely on external help if things can be done independently. People are disabled when the technology and options for engaging with websites do not meet their needs. So if your website is inaccessible to assistive technology like screen readers that people with visual impairments use, you are in fact causing the barrier. Because HTML does not discriminate against people. You have everything that you need to make websites accessible there. It's really important to understand that it's the choices our designers, developers, and content creators make that may cause a website to be inaccessible. So in its core, accessibility is all about learning out of some bad habits. Unfortunately, a lot of organizations do really not understand the scope of disability market. If you try to close your eyes there and imagine a person with a disability, who do you think about? Is it someone in a wheelchair? Someone who needs assistance? You're absolutely right. But what we often forget about is that many people have invisible disabilities, and not everyone who has a disability will even self-identify as having a disability. For instance, 10% of all people have dyslexia and benefit of websites that are clear, intuitive, and easy to read. 10% of all men are colorblind, and they need information online to be distinguishable in ways that do not require you to tell green and red apart, for instance. There's a growing number of people with cognitive disabilities like autism, ADHD, dyspraxia, because these conditions are being recognized in youth earlier. There's a big risk you are unintentionally excluding these people who want to engage with you and buy your product because you are not considering their needs actively. So how big of a group of people are we then talking about? With an estimated population of 1.85 billion people with disabilities constitute an emerging market in the size of China plus the European Union. That's a lot of people. And of course, the friends and family add another 3.4 billion potential consumers, and they are going to act on their emotional connection to the nearest and dearest people. And as you mentioned in the introduction, elderly people have the need and desire to remain active in society, and their needs are also dovetailing with the demands of people with disabilities. And if you didn't know, elderly people are the wealthiest demographic in human history. So for private businesses, it should be interesting. And lastly, we have a lot of people who benefit of accessibility because of temporary situations. Someone with a broken mouse hand might instead use keyboard to navigate on a website. Someone who forgot their reading glasses home might benefit of good color contrasts on a website. Or a tired new parent will thank you for providing clear user interfaces and, a simple readability level. So basically, any one of us may end up in a situation where we need accessibility. Now, in European Union, we do have a legislation that requires accessibility from public sector, and the legislation is on its way to expand also to the private sector to require all essential services online to comply with certain criteria defined by the World Wide Web Consortium. And this is, of course, important and should be a minimum what you aim for. But I will not talk about legislation today. You have heard enough about legislation. And I don't want to talk about it because it doesn't guarantee a nice user experience. So if you are considering accessibility as a list of technical criteria to fulfill, you're doing it wrong. Understanding the variety of user needs should rather be your tool to create great services for all. So to recap, there's the tangible part of accessibility, the international standards and laws. We have VCAC and EN 301-549, I think it's called. And then there is the intangible, real people and the real people's real experiences. On the comic strip I have added to this slide, you can see a janitor who is shoveling snow upstairs, and there's a wheelchair user who is asking, could you please shovel the ramp? And the janitor is answering, all these other kids are waiting to use the stairs. When I get through shoveling them off, then I will clear the ramp for you. And then the wheelchair user is answering, but if you shovel the ramp, we can all get in. And that is summarizing accessibility. When you build services that are accessible, you're building services that work for all from the get-go. Next, I'd like to address accessibility needs for digital environments in practice and how they are benefiting us all. So let's take as the first example physical disabilities. We have several conditions that can impact the motoric capabilities of internet users: amputation, arthritis, repetitive stress injury, tremors, and so on. People who have physical disabilities may use assistive technology like a mouse emulator. They can control with eye gaze or a sensor attached to their cheek, like perhaps you remember Stephen Hawking used one of those. Or some people can use the keyboard to navigate on a website instead of mouse. There are a lot of adaptive strategies that might come into question here. Many assistive devices used by individuals do actually require interaction with the keyboard specifically. Interaction with the mouse for someone who has, for instance, tremors can be difficult because operating a mouse requires fine movements. And then for someone who navigates with keyboard only, it helps a lot when you're able to, for instance, see which element is in focus when you're tapping on the website. And sometimes not just the mouse is hard to control, but the keyboard can be hard to control too. So for this reason, your websites, well, let's take as an example, forms. They need to be designed to tolerate errors like spelling mistakes. For instance, you can highlight each error and use a script to automatically move focus in the form field so that a user knows exactly where did I actually do this mistake. So in a nutshell, you can't support only one way of operating on the website. There are different ways. One more example of a software people with physical or motor impairment might use is a software that allows you to control your computer via spoken commands or voice dictation, which of course requires that the website has clear and common labels for controls that are easy to speak out and activate. And we will see voice-directed software becoming more and more prominent in the future as well. Now, how are these basic principles helping us all? So imagine a situation where you're using a website on your mobile phone in a bus, a shaking bus. So the experience you're having could be comparable to someone who has a trembling hand. If the website has buttons that are decent size, both you in a bus and someone with a trembling hand are able to use the service more easily. Secondly, we have visual disabilities, color blindness, low vision, blindness, deaf blindness, and there is a lot of us. And the older we become, the more likely it is that we will have low vision. Having focus on colors and contrast is going to benefit all of us. Insufficient contrast of the font makes content hard to read, and for someone with low vision or color blindness, it might make it impossible. I do not know why, but there is even this tendency that often the most important button on the website has the worst contrast. Like having your call to action colored with pastel colors would make it more appealing to click, but in fact, it makes it harder to find, which is exactly the opposite of what you want to achieve. People who have low vision often require resizing text to be able to read it. And while it's very important to have readable font family and size, since there are basically plenty of people who are not very familiar with Zoom software or resizing font using the browser settings, but in the same time, you should allow people to change the font size themselves, should they want to. Unfortunately, a lot of websites fail here, and when zooming in, the websites break unexpectedly. For instance, this morning I was reading news from a Maltese news website. I zoomed into 200%, which is usually what I like to have, but then the website, when it was zoomed in, the whole menu basically disappeared completely and prevented me from navigating further. So the third practical tip I have is to avoid using colors as the only means of communicating information. Let's say that you designed an e-commerce website where the user will need to select the color of the products. It's very important that the color is also described in text. Those 10% of men buying pants, they would not know if it's a green or a red pant. That is how frequent color blindness is. And of course, this example should be applied in all cases in which you want to mark something using a color. A person who cannot operate using their vision may use a screen reading program that will read website content aloud. For instance, if you have an image content on your website, the screen reader would read aloud the information provided about the image. That's in the code of the image itself. So you can provide text alternatives for images, making also the screen reader user able to know what the image is about. Also, this behavior needs to be implemented for any visual content, for instance, video elements. Then we have clear descriptive headings on a website. They are great for search engine optimization, but headings just don't have this purpose only. They will furthermore help the users to scan a page, to see the essential information fast, and help a screen reader to skim page content fast by basically jumping from heading to heading. And in this way, a user will be able to digest the main information of the website effortlessly. And then lastly, if you use a screen reader, you do not want to navigate through the same menu item every single time you access another page. So it's a requirement to provide a method to jump over repeated content. And often this is done using some kind of skip link that allows the user to jump right into the main content of the website should they navigate on keyboard or a screen reader. And of course, there are other criteria as well, but I wanted to highlight these as some of the more frequent issues that we see on websites. As a third disability group, we have auditory disabilities like hard of hearing, deafness, or deaf blindness. With auditory disabilities, it's important to remember that whenever there is sound, you should provide text transcripts and captions. And to be quite frank, captions are increasing the consumptions of video content among all your users because it enables you to watch videos in any kind of surroundings. I do, for instance, travel quite a bit, but instead of listening to videos, I rely on captions there. Basically, I jump over any video that is not captioned when I'm in noisy surroundings. And then sign language is the mother tongue of many people with hearing impairments. Sign language interpretation can be beneficial, especially while transmitting live content. Then we have cognitive disabilities that are actually the biggest disability group. ADHD, memory impairments, autism spectrum disorder, learning difficulties like dyslexia. Dyslexia is very common and impacts around every 10th of us. For cognitive disabilities, the rule of thumb is that you provide information in a clear and concise way. This helps readability when you're using headings, subheadings, and lists for structuring information. It helps people to easily scan the page to see the essential information. One good advice is also to keep the line length short. Short sentences are easier to read by any kind of people. In public agencies, universities, central government, we tend to use very, very complex language. We are the world champions in complex language. Complex language does not make anyone sound more credible or professional, even though we might think so. That's a misconception. What complex language does is that it excludes readers with cognitive disabilities or who, for a reason or another, are unable to concentrate fully, like parents of small children. And then one very important one, you should use colors, fonts, and locations of elements consistently. Consistency is basically key for great user experience. There are certain places where users expect you to have your search feature or your contact information. And in case things are placed in unexpected location, it can cause challenges. Keyboard navigation support will help users who would have a hard time following cursor movements of the mouse on the screen. This can actually require a lot of concentration. And then lastly, people with visual impairment are not the only users of screen readers, but people with dyslexia can also benefit of text being read aloud. And as the last group, I wanted to also mention speech disabilities that include difficulty producing speech that is recognizable by others or by voice recognition software. For example, the loudness or clarity of somebody's voice might be difficult to understand. Speech disability could be, for instance, stuttering or muteness or apraxia of speech, which includes inconsistent articulation or production of speech sounds. People with speech disabilities encounter barriers, especially with voice-based services such as automated web-based hotlines and web applications that are operated using voice commands. To use services that rely on voice, people with speech disabilities need alternative modes of interaction, such as text-based chat to interact with hotline reps and keyword commands to operate with web applications. And also websites that provide telephone numbers as the only means of communicating with an organization are posing barriers for people with speech disabilities. Of course, then alternative means of communication could include email and feedback forms. But now, talking about all of us, we have also preferences. Someone might be most comfortable doing a phone call, and I personally, I'd rather use email if I can avoid calling somebody. So we have covered now some of the most common disability types and practical examples on website accessibility. Some of the practical tips I have given might sound technical. Some might sound like it's not your responsibility. It's true, accessibility is not a one-person job. Basically, anyone who does web content, design or code or coordinate this work needs to have a certain understanding of accessibility and what should they in their daily work basically take in consideration. So I'm next talking more about roles and responsibilities within accessibility. Starting with management. Accessibility will hardly ever be a priority without management buy-in. We need managers in different organizations to understand both the business impact as well as the user impact of inclusion and set it as a priority, because often starting to work with accessibility from scratch, it requires changes to design, it requires changes to implementation, it requires also changes to just purely the way of working. There is going to be technical accessibility depth to address. We need managers to communicate these priorities and changes to entire teams, which serves several purposes. It's informative, it holds everyone accountable, but it is as well giving the mandate to make sure that everything we deliver meets a certain criteria. So if accessibility and deadlines would be in conflict, accessibility should remain a priority. Adopting this mindset is going to, of course, be a continuous process. It won't happen from one day to another, but management buy-in is certainly an important step. And secondly, if everyone is responsible, nobody is responsible, which is why we advocate that organizations should appoint someone to be responsible for inclusion and accessibility in general. And ideally, working towards inclusion should be someone's job description. It really helps when there is someone to rely on to drive change and, enhance the general inclusion and accessibility of products, but as well, people's knowledge level. And next we have project managers and product owners who could, for instance, be responsible for a website. The product owner's job is to map, delegate, and monitor stakeholders' responsibilities within accessibility. They do carry the responsibility of delivering an accessible website in the end, which therefore requires them to both understand the legal requirements as well as the key responsibilities of the people who design, test, develop, and create content. And lastly, it's often the project manager or product owner who is responsible for an up-to-date accessibility statement. If we're talking about public sector websites now, a statement is basically required to list all the accessibility bugs that are still remaining, and then it also offers a channel for accessibility feedback. If the project manager would not understand the accessibility requirements, they would not be able to maintain this, or they would not be able to prioritize the accessibility bugs based on severity. So they are actually super big contributors here. I've been a little cheeky here and grouped both visual and UX designers into one group. It's different roles, but the responsibilities are somewhat overlapping. If there's some designers out there, don't be mad at me. So the first responsibility is use of colors and contrast. The brand colors, the colors of different elements on a website, colors of links in different states, and the colors of fine print as well. I'll tell you a secret. Not even fine print can have poor color contrast. There is no reason for you to put light gray on top of white. Why would you have any content that you do not want people to discover? Contrast can be easily fixed, but it can be quite a big conversation if you discover that your brand colors do not meet contrast requirements. We have seen this many times. For instance, brands like, a random example, Scandinavian Airlines, they have a very, monochromatic color scheme. It's blue on blue on blue, and, putting light blue on dark blue can cause contrast issues. So it's often a big conversation if it's brand colors. Designers are also responsible for the semantic structure of the website. What is the user experience for assistive technology users? What does the screen reader say when you focus on a menu, and what are the accessibility side effects of user paths we want our users to take? What we think is really helpful for designers is to involve users with disabilities and with different technology needs into your user personas and user stories, and involve real people with diverse needs when you conduct user testing as well. Here's one example of a UX designer's task regarding accessibility: to think about the focus order of elements. So this is how the order of navigation in a carousel element looks for a lot of screen reader or keyboard only users. So starting at the left arrow, working through the thumbnails, then getting into the content you actually want to see, except that you get it in a confusing order. You get a picture first without context, then heading and content. And yeah, this can be overwhelming. And Sometimes going forward is easy enough, but if you want to navigate back, you have to tap through a lot of elements, all of these elements again. And this is actually one of the better cases I'm showing here. It's our suggestion for a DOM order for a carousel that a customer really insisted having. But as you see, it's complex, it's still difficult to navigate with a keyboard, and it might still be barring a group of users from potentially relevant content. So even if your developers do manage to make the carousel technically accessible when meeting all VCAC criteria, the user experience will never be excellent. So thinking about accessibility should start already in early design when you make decisions on, like, should we have a carousel on our website or not? Maybe not. And of course, developers are one of the key stakeholders as well. I'm starting with the notion that working myself in product development, and therefore I know that regarding accessibility, the conversation between the designer and developer is very important. The conversation between these people before the implementation is essential for finding economical approaches without unnecessary compromises for design and accessibility. Technically, developers are responsible for implementing accessible definitions like HTML ARIA attributes, and they also need to make sure that the DOM order and browser focus with JavaScript will work. In our team, our developers unit test their own code with a browser plugin and screen reader as well for basic sanity checks before they are handing code over to testing. And this helps them also to learn hands-on and to avoid the same mistakes in the future. Then handing over to testers. Testers have both, automated and manual testing processes for VCAC validation, and for them as well, it is beneficial to assess use cases with keyboard only and with assistive tech to make sure that user experience is as expected. Now, I have spent a lot of time talking about the development side of things, but no matter how technically accessible solution you have created, does it matter if your content is inaccessible? Content creators and marketers carry also a huge role here, and especially in public sector, we have a really broad variety of content creators. Imagine a university, for instance. They have faculties that have people responsible for content, researchers, teachers, students, and all of them can be creating content online. It's a lot of people to educate and requires definitely a systematic approach for education and then managing the change when people need to unlearn out of their bad habits, and of course monitoring as well. And there's some examples here that a content creator or marketer should be thinking about. They need to think about providing alternative text for image content. That content is structured with clear headings that can be, both browsed with a screen reader, but as well as easily understood by people who have cognitive disabilities. That link texts can be understood easily. That videos have subtitles, and thus can be understood also by someone with hearing impairment. And beyond the web content accessibility guidelines, accessibility also means that you focus on having a simple readability level, you avoid jargon, and you're using also inclusive language. And lastly, the responsibilities on accessibility do not stop with development teams and content creators. If you say that you foster inclusion, it should also show in other places than your own website. When you are procuring IT systems for your own use, when you are choosing an agency partner, procurement should have an understanding on how to evaluate if something is accessible. Imagine a situation where you would have, let's say, a ticketing system for your technical support, and the ticketing system would be inaccessible. Can you hire a support agent with a visual impairment? If that is your best candidate, you have to. Otherwise, you are discriminating based on somebody's disability. So, of course, accessibility is not just something that you do on a website, but something that should be a part of your culture. And then this is the last slide. I stumbled upon this quote by Adam Grant, who is an organizational psychologist, and I thought it's a good way to end this talk. Great minds don't think alike. They challenge each other to think differently. The people who teach you the most are the people who share your principles, but not your thought process. Converging values draw you to similar questions, diverging views introduce you to new answers. For me, this quote summarizes why diversity, accessibility, and inclusion are key for driving innovation now and in the future. That's all I had.